South Lancashire, England, the 19th century. A man is sitting in a cosy room in his house reading a book. Suddenly, out of the chimney rolls a cat in a cloud of soot. The cat gathers herself and looks up at the man.
"Tell Dildrum that Dildrum is dead,"
she cries out. And as quick as she stumbled into the room, she scuttles back up the chimney. The man's wife enters the room shortly after, with their own pet cat. The man, startled by the event, says,
"A cat just fell from the chimney, dear. Apparently I'm to tell Dildrum that Dildrum is dead."
Suddenly, their own cat exclaims excitedly,
"Dildrum is dead?"
And he too runs into the opening, never to be seen again. This is the most common version of an old British folktale about Dildrum, also known as King of the Cats. Recorded in the 1873 book Lancashire Legends, written by John Harland and Thomas Wilkinson. In this version, it is assumed that the cat who lives with the couple is in fact Dildrum, who, upon hearing about the demise of Dildrum, is the new heir to the cat kingdom. Other variations of the tale often have slightly different settings, a series of events and names, such as Tildrum or even Moll Brown instead of Dildrum. In a version of the tale from Ireland, the story goes that a young man is travelling towards Dublin when he comes across a neighbour's cat, frantically yelling,
"Would you tell Moll Brown that Tom Dunn is dead? Would you tell Moll Brown that Tom Dunn is dead?"
Tired of the incessant yelling, the man picks up a small rock and hurls it at the cat, bidding him to leave him in peace. Later, he stops by a tap room for a pot of beer. He begins telling the folk there about the strange event on his travel. Sat by the fire was a small grey cat, comfortably resting. Upon hearing the man's story though, she stood up, lamenting,
"That's my husband! That's my husband!"
and she runs off, never to be seen again. This version of the story has a slightly more domestic tone to it. There's no suggestion of a cat kingdom being relevant to the story. But even in the Dildrum tale, there is no direct reference to any sort of kingdom there. So where did this part of the tale come from? There's various versions around the British Isles that tell of the young man of the story not just bumping into a soul cat at home or on his travels, but a whole funeral procession of cats doing ceremony for a clearly significant loss in their community. Take this version from the northern part of the Highlands in Scotland, which has two young men living with an older lady, her two dogs and a pet cat. One afternoon, the youngest of the men decides to go into the woods, retracing the path they had taken the day before whilst hunting for birds, promising to be back by sunset. Later in the evening, once the sun had set, he'd still not returned. Suddenly, he enters the house hurriedly.
You must be wondering what made me so late. I have had a curious adventure today. I hardly know what to say about it. I went, as I told you I should, along our yesterday's route. A mountain fog came on just as I was about to turn in homewards, and I completely lost my way. I wandered about for a long time, not knowing where I was, till at last I saw a light and made for it, hoping to get help. As I came near it, it disappeared, and I found myself close to a large old oak tree. I climbed into the branches, the better to look for the light, and behold, it was beneath me, inside the hollow trunk of the tree. I seemed to be looking down into a church, where a funeral was in the act of taking place. I heard singing, and saw a coffin surrounded by torches, all carried by... But I know you won't believe me if I tell you.
The old lady and the other men turn their attention fully, awaiting the conclusion of his tale. The dogs are sleeping, but the cat raises its head, also keenly listening in.
Yes, it is perfectly true. The coffin and the torches were both borne by cats, and upon the coffin were marked a crown and sceptre.
The cat rises suddenly.
By Jove, old Peter's dead and I'm the king of the cats.
He rushes up the chimney, never to be seen again. We see that the King of the Cats theme is much more apparent in this version, and others, of which there are many subtle variations previously mentioned, are where the assumptions made about the Dildrum in Lancashire version are almost certainly come from. As with many folk tales, Dildrum, or King of the Cats, is what is known as a migratory legend, a story which can be found repeatedly in various locations around Britain and other places in Europe, and sometimes beyond, with only slight variations in the details, often to fit the topographical context of where the tale is located. It is assumed that many of these legends would have passed between and circulated amongst communities spanning back for hundreds of years, potentially reaching as far back as the classical era. It is interesting that the King of the Cats tale is so widespread. The association between cats and some sort of clandestine supernatural royalty seems a very deeply rooted myth.
Yes, cats are queer folk, sure enough. And often no more than a simple beast ought to, by knowledge that's rightly come by.
Charles John Tibbs, Folklore and Legends, 1890. Love them or hate them, cats are and always have been culturally significant. Ancient cultures would often worship cats and adorn their art, society and religious practices in honour of them. They seem to represent a sort of mystical property, which humans adored and later feared, as we shall see. However, as the Dildrum myth circulates beyond the British Isles, the cat element seems to be much less present, replaced by often ambiguous human characters or supernatural beings. It may be that cats later became used as a primary component in the story because of their strong historical cross-cultural adoration, but also because of the difficult relationship cats had with the Catholic Church, which I'll touch on later. There is a catless version of the tale called Le Petit Colin from the island of Guernsey, off the French coast in the English Channel, where superstition about witchcraft and spirits go back a long way. A Monsieur Dumaresque hired a young servant boy who was incredibly attentive to his work, lively but very small, acquiring in the name Petit Colin. One evening, Monsieur Dumaresque was travelling home by horse and cart, passing what was known as Haunted Hill. It was here that he heard his name called out. Startled, he looks around, but nobody is present. Then it happens again. His name is called. Stopping again, this time feeling more uneasy, he looks around nervously. Again, nobody. Pushing forward a little faster this time, his name is called out again. "Who calls? And what do you need?" he finally asks out loud.
"Go home directly and tell Petit Colin that Grand Colin is dead."
Obeying the instruction, Dumaresque returns home and tells Petit Colin what he has heard. As in the Dildrum tale, Petit Colin rushes away. Monsieur Dumaresque shouts, "Wait! I still have to pay you your wages." But Colin smugly states, "Wages? Bah! I am far richer now than you. Goodbye." This is very similar to another folk tale called The Unknown Girl from Germany, in which a very industrious and well-behaved servant girl of unknown name or origin is told a strange tale by her master in which he was travelling, hears a ghostly voice telling him to tell Gloria that the Chancellor has died. Upon hearing this, she leaps up and is never heard from again. Even without the cats present, the myth harbours a definite supernatural element, particularly with the ghostly messenger. In variations of the myth from Germany, there seems to be an unknown presence, often a dwarf, lurking in the returning traveller's cellar or a dark corner of the house, which, upon hearing the story of him receiving the ghostly message, either leaps out, revealing that it had been stealing beer from the man, or simply makes a shuffling noise from the cellar below, and disappears. Dwarves, trolls and even fairies become interchangeable in different versions of the tale, where the cat would later be present in the British and Irish versions. Some German takes on the myth suggest a community of subterranean trolls live in mountainous regions, where the traveller would encounter the initial message. This is the same in a version of the tale from Denmark called King Pipe is Dead, which I won't go into too much detail as the basic premise is very much the same as the Dildrum myth. A particularly significant version of this tale, though, is another which originates in Denmark. In this one, there is a community of troll folk who live in the mountains. One troll, named Nuremura, which means rumble grumble, became insanely jealous upon sensing that a young troll in the village had become a little too intimate with his wife, vowing to get vengeance. The young troll on the receiving end of this accusation transforms himself into a tortoise-shell cat, climbs down the mountain and takes up residence in the house of a poor old man named Platt. Here he stays in the company of Platt for a long time, until one day Platt arrives home saying, "Hark, dame, till I tell you what happened to me on the road. Just as I was coming past Brondøy, there came out a troll, and he called out to me and said, 'Hark, Platt, tell your cat that Nuremura is dead.' As expected, the cat gets up on his hind legs, runs back home, transforming back into the troll form, and Platt never sees him again. To further understand the association of cats to supernatural beings, it's worth looking into the complex ways in which human society often perceive cats throughout history. Contrary to popular thought, the link between cats and witches didn't actually arise until the early modern era, approximately around the 1500s, right on the threshold of the end of the medieval era. The infamous Dominican inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, who co-wrote the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, a book detailing the supposed activities of witches and witchcraft, makes very little mention of a relationship between cats and witches. In the book, he briefly mentions a story in which a man was chopping wood only to be attacked by a trio of cats. He beats one of them on the head and injures the other two, causing them to run away. Later he is arrested for violently attacking 3 honourable women of the town. His defence was that they were obviously shape-shifting witches. Kramer uses this as evidence for the shape-shifting capabilities of witches. In the medieval period, cats were often perceived as worthy companions in households, mainly for practical reasons. They could catch rats and mice, which kept domestic living clear from unwanted pests. Although this was sometimes something to even be wary of, as demonstrated by William Caxton, who wrote,
"The devil plays often with the sinner, just as the cat does with the mouse."
Dr. Iniela Metzler is a historian who believes that cats were seen as too independent for their own good. To the medieval mind, animals were made by God to be controlled by humans. Anything that was wild, undomesticated, and unfitting into the Catholic narrative of God's will must be an agent of Lucifer. Cats refused to obey. As Robert Anton Wilson suggested, and I'm paraphrasing, you can shame a dog into obedience, but nobody has ever succeeded in shaming a cat. Pope Gregory IX declared in the 13th century that Lucifer was, in fact, half cat. Around 1180, Walter Map, an English writer and courtier, stated that
"The devil descends as a black cat before his devotees. The worshippers put out the light and draw near to the place where they saw their master. They feel after him, and when they have found him, they kiss him under the tail."
With such influential figures of the time making very strong statements, it would inevitably influence social perception. Even the Knights Templar, an incredibly powerful institution in the medieval socio-political world, were all but destroyed by the Catholic Church following spurious accusations of blasphemy. Apart from supposedly worshipping a false deity called Baphomet and a number of other anti-Catholic behaviours, one major accusation was the worshipping and invitation of cats as part of their rituals. In fact, many significant groups in the early Middle Ages were accused of blasphemy by worshipping cats, including the Cathars. It's evident that cats could be weaponised to destroy the reputation of anybody not following the Catholic authority at the time, because cats and heretics were one and the same in their essential nature: disobedient. I also have an additional theory. Nowadays, cat videos and memes are so incredibly popular on the internet that it's undeniable that whether or not you love or hate cats, humans generally have a particular reverence for them. We go back to ancient Egypt and you will find cats worshipped as godlike figures. At one point during the history of the Egyptian civilization, the household in which a cat lived would ritualistically shave off their eyebrows to mourn the loss of the beloved feline friend. However, due to the emphasis on spiritual divinity in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church would demonise anything which might bring about worldly pleasures, because that would distract a person from their attention towards God. Perhaps the Church, being aware of an essential allure in cats, along with their independent nature, were intimidated by this. However, there are plenty of examples of cats being well-loved companions to figures even in the Catholic Church, being found in numerous bestiaries and manuscript illuminations. A 9th century monk living in Ryconor Abbey.
So in our peace our tasks we ply, Pangaban, my cat, and I. In our arts we find our bliss. I have mine, and he has his.
There's an acknowledgement of his cat's independence, but a certain affection which is undeniable. On the 8th of April 1554, a cat was hung from the gallows in London by an unknown culprit, dressed like a priest, with a Eucharistic wafer in his foot. This was deemed a political protest at the time, a mockery of the Catholic Church and how, from a Protestant perspective, it had become corrupt and itself distracted by worldly gains. The poor cat was satirised as a symbol of corruption, since they had previously been associated with the devil by the Catholic Church. Scientific rationalism was fast emerging as a popular worldview. Though often seen as divorced from religion, this would have been a huge part of the undercurrent of social change, intertwined with the Protestant movement due to their radical nature of challenging the Catholic establishment. It could be argued that there are similarities in the conflicts between contemporary conservative and right-leaning politics and liberal and left-leaning politics. In recent years, both have become increasingly radical and reactive in their own various and complex ways, which can and have had consequences and unexpected outcomes, which we are all aware of. In the 16th century, a violent Protestant statement against the Catholic Church involving the murder of a cat symbolises how heated the bickering was between two ideologies during the time of radical social change. If you spend much time on the internet as of late, it won't take you long to come across arguments between people accusing each other of either being far-right fascist Nazis or liberal leftist cultural Marxists with an agenda for social control. Imagine the heat of this discourse on the internet, but much more prominent in the physical world. It's now not uncommon for people to receive death or rape threats over the internet. This is where accusations of witchcraft and satanic ritualism could be used to get your own back on a neighbour that you really didn't like, probably with a slightly different religious and political view to you. Emotions were high and society was paranoid and tense. The witch hunting craze swept across Europe and America for a long, long time with varying intensity. Anybody with a cat was almost asking for trouble. Even if you didn't have a pet cat, but were unfortunate enough to have a cat regularly visiting your home or in the garden, a paranoid or vindictive neighbour may well use this to report you to the religious authorities, branding you as a witch and the cat as your familiar. A familiar is a supernatural spirit or entity which often accompanies a witch or occult practitioner. In 1658, Edward Topsell wrote,
"The familiars of witches do most ordinarily appear in the shape of cats, which is an argument that this beast is dangerous to soul and body."
Heinrich Kramer, mentioned earlier, helped to popularise and legitimise the extermination of witches, quite likely taking opportunities granted by the high levels of social tension and paranoia to exploit his own unconscious and sadistic desires, leading to thousands upon thousands of people being brutally murdered, beaten and burnt at the stake. Cat torture escalated dramatically during this time, seemingly becoming a sport and or a community event in many regions across Europe, such as the Festival of Cats in Ypres, Belgium, in which the townspeople would hurl cats from the belfry and then burn them alive. The practice ended in 1817, but the festival still occurs annually, just in a much less barbaric fashion. Another example includes the city of Bruges in 1582. A prince and duke were visiting the city, so the people arranged a welcome show, which involved a huge wooden ship being built and placed in the central square. They filled the ship with fireworks and cats. They lit the fireworks. They watched the cats squeal in traumatic horror. And they set the ship on fire, burning them all alive after. There are many, many examples of ritualistic and community cat torture that occurred during this time. Another popular activity in Denmark, and possibly spreading to other places beyond, was to place a black cat in a barrel. The townsfolk would then beat the barrel with sticks until it shattered, releasing the cat, whereupon they would chase it down and beat it to death. This was to signify the arrival of spring and supposedly help beat away evil spirits to mark the seasonal change. It's always shocking how evil acts can be so convincingly justified as an attempt to ward off evil in the collective human psyche. Even today, black cats are seen as bad omens and are significantly less likely to be adopted. It's absolutely clear that cats have been an important part of human history, but particularly European history since the Middle Ages. In England alone, Beware the Cat, written by William Baldwin in 1553, although it wasn't published until 1561, is not only the first piece of horror fiction longer than a short story, but the very first English novel. In the novel, a young man comes across a cat which says to him, "Tell your kitten that Grimalkin is dead." The man, startled by the event, later tells his wife about it all, and as he does so, their kitten overhears, saying, "And Grimalkin is dead? Then farewell, dame." As we can see, the Dildrum tale has its claws even in the origins of the English novel. Interestingly, there is a later suggestion that the cats in the story are in fact witches. The narrator seeks out a magic potion which allows him to hear the language of cats, which in turn gives him insight into the life of a cat named Mouse Slayer, which the novel then continues to follow as she tries to exonerate herself from a court of cats under the accusation that she is a shape-shifting witch. It serves as a parody of the overly superstitious beliefs that the Catholic Church upheld, before and increasingly during the time of the Protestant Reformation when it was written. It seems that despite a horrendous smear campaign by the religious authorities, that lasted hundreds of years, escalating to what can only be described as mass genocide and widespread sadistic torture, cats have retained our attention to the present day. As mentioned earlier, the internet and YouTube is made up of a large percentage of cat videos. People simply cannot get enough. If that's not evidence of supernatural power, then I really don't know what is.